and Clear.
Welcome back to Loud and Clear. I'm Brian Becker.
And I'm John Kiriakou.
The twice-a-decade Chinese Communist Party Congress has voted to make reference to Xi Jinping thought in its constitution. As the first living Chinese president to have his name added to the party constitution since Mao Zedong, will Xi Jinping bring about major changes in the country? We are joined from Toronto by political analyst and writer Ajit Singh. Welcome back, Ajit. There's a lot of talk about what Xi Jinping's leadership actually means inside of China, inside the Chinese Communist Party. It's clearly a leadership that has a singular type importance, perhaps more important than the former Chinese presidents since, say, Deng Xiaoping. And the media has lots of different takes about it. Will Xi Jinping, when he leaves office after 10 years, which he's constitutionally required to do, will he continue to be, as the U.S. media says, China's strongman? Will he really wield influence? Will he be a dominant type leader? Not to mention all of the actual content of Xi Jinping's program and his ideological sort of focus within the Chinese Communist Party. What's your take on this?
Yes, I think there are two aspects which I would focus on. Firstly, I think you're correct in saying that Xi Jinping's a singular leader, and his focus is really significant, and his leadership has marked a decisive shift in course for the Communist Party. What was announced at this most recent Congress is that the party is changing its view of Chinese society as being one which needs to combat inequality in order to meet people's needs. This is the main focus of the party. Previously, the focus of the party was on building up the economy to meet people's needs. And so this really marks a shift in the direction over the past 30 years. And there's been a big focus on building unity and discipline in the party around the leadership of the party under his presidency and the leadership of the Central Committee. And we've seen this with the 5-year-long anti-corruption campaign, which has really stipulated new strict requirements on party work, new regulations in order to try and promote what they see as necessary for the party and necessary for party vitality, which is more grassroots linked, less extravagance, less corruption, less individualism in the party, more governance, and we see that Xi Jinping's been entered into the constitution. Xi Jinping's thought on socialism for Chinese characteristics for a new era. And there's a really strong support around Xi Jinping. He's been designated as a core leader.
Ajit, I'm just to interrupt for a second. So what's the distinction with the label core leader?
Yes, so core leader is sort of a formal label which the party can designate someone. It's not always the president or even the general secretary, which is the title of the leader in the party. It's just what the party designates as being the person or the area which all other party members should sort of orient themselves towards supporting. So a few years ago, Xi Jinping was designated as core, and there's this sort of means that the party is trying to ensure that from the grassroots level all the way up, there's really a focus towards the thought and the principles which were just enshrined in the Constitution. And these principles include ensuring stronger party leadership, improving the quality of the party. There's really been a focus on rooting out bad party work or what it deems bad party work, focusing on environmentalism. People-centered approach is the term they use, and building international cooperation and a greater role for China in international affairs. What we've seen in the second aspect is, while I see Xi Jinping's influence and the leadership around him as really being a strong force in China, which I think is going to have a lasting impact going into the future, there's, I think, a lot of inaccurate and dishonest reporting on China in Western corporate media. They've been really trying to portray it as sort of Xi Jinping as one individual controlling all of the strings in China's country of 1.4 billion people. And I think there is a legacy of several things going on here. A sort of Western colonial chauvinism, which refuses to accept a world in which there are areas of importance outside of only the West, and which refuses and is resistant towards the end of Western political domination, which we've seen in the world over the past few centuries. There's also the typical anti-communism and anti-socialism, which is sort of a quote unofficial religion in the West. And so there's lots of loaded terminology and biases, as China's a, quote, totalitarian dictatorship in a very sinister place. I think when they talk about Xi Jinping, there's sort of this attempt to try and portray China as having no democracy, and really feeding into this legacy of yellow peril, Orientalism and xenophobia and racism, and the idea that Chinese leaders are Oriental despots who rule with an iron fist. A lot of the coverage in the New York Times yesterday, there's a piece with the headline, quote, "As China's Xi Jinping unveils new leaders, will he include an heir?" And CNN today published a piece titled "Xi Jinping Cements Grip on Power" with the tagline, Xi Jinping, the move means that he can be an emperor for life. And I think this is really dishonest, and they're trying to sort of depict Xi Jinping as some sort of sinister, malicious character who's really self-interested. And I don't think that's accurate. In China, there's a 5-year presidential limit with a 2-term limit. There are delegates at the National Congress, which closed yesterday. That's the highest decision-making body in the country. Thousands of delegates are elected to attend. They review the party work, and they decide on the course going forward, and they elect a central committee who elects a leader. And I think they're really trying to say, like, well, Xi Jinping just is going to pick everyone, and Xi Jinping can appoint an heir. And this is really has no basis. If we look at comparisons with like the United States, for example, throughout the past century, you can count on your hand the number of times you see the Roosevelts in positions of power or in presidency, the Kennedys, the Bushes and Clintons.
Ajit, let me jump in because we don't have that long. I hear you about the United States and the sort of the different family dynastic. We have the Bushes, the Clintons, the Roosevelts, et cetera. But I don't want to compare China to the United States. I want to compare China to China just for the sake of trying to understand what might be coming with the new leader, with this very singular leadership, the Xi Jinping leadership. And I agree with you that there has been a lot of caricaturing, as there is always, and a lot of racist caricaturing, as happens frequently in the U.S. media about Chinese leadership. But Walter, let's jump to you real quick. After Mao Zedong died in 1976, there was a leadership shakeup. The Mao faction went to prison, the Gang of Four. And then 2 years later, Deng Xiaoping's grouping came into power. And then they had a major policy reorientation. That was called the opening of China, integrating China into the world economy, allowing foreign direct investment into China, allowing capitalist property relations to develop in China. And as a consequence of China's integration into the world economy, it has grown rapidly. And hundreds of millions of people have emerged out of poverty, but there have also been the growth of class contradictions and class polarization. And at the end of the Deng Xiaoping era, there was the Tiananmen Square incident, where there was another internal party struggle. The general secretary of the party was purged because he was considered to be sympathetic to the student protesters. And the Chinese Communist Party under Deng Xiaoping's leadership cleared the square and stopped what might have been a similar overturn of the government as happened in the Soviet Union or inside of Eastern Europe. And then the Chinese Communist Party, as it restabilized, adopted sort of an institutional transition of power so that it wouldn't be like a huge factional struggle when a great leader sort of departs, as happened with Mao or happened with Deng Xiaoping or happened after the death of Lenin or after the death of Stalin inside the Soviet Union. So there was this idea of having a smooth constitutional transition, the 2 5-year terms for the presidency. And I think what the media is trying to get at is that even if the formality of Xi Jinping's adherence to the Constitution happens, which it will Xi Jinping have the kind of leadership stature that, even though informal, is real beyond his 2 terms? In other words, going back to the singularity or centrality of a particular leadership rather than the party as a whole. What's your view?
I think there's a possibility for that happening. I think the principal consideration whenever a social system or a type of government decides to emphasize the leadership of one individual or of one family, it's generally a response to substantial outside pressures. So, for instance, there was a sharp turn towards emphasis of the leadership of the Kim family in Korea as a consequence of the Sino-Soviet split. And in China, they're dealing with a major transformation from a country that was primarily based on manufacturing for export to one that's based principally on internal demand and internal consumption. And so the leadership of Xi Jinping, I think, could be considered by some to be a helpful thing in this transitional process. Xi Jinping also, at this party congress, didn't appear to appoint or elevate any one of his senior lieutenants to a position whereby they would be sort of the heir apparent, the obvious person to take over once his second 5-year term runs out. There's an informal rule in the Chinese Communist Party called 67 up, 68 down. So if you're 67 years old, you're allowed to be up for reappointment to another position. If you're 68, you're supposed to stand down. And so the head of China's anti-corruption campaign, who I believe is 69 or 70 years old, there was some speculation that, if he ignores this rule and if he is reappointed for another term, then that would be an indicator that Xi Jinping, who would also be over 67 by the time his next term is out, might agree, or this would be sort of like setting the table or setting the scene for him to also ignore that rule. But that didn't happen. So the head of the anti-corruption campaign stepped down.
Ajit, there's no question about inside of China that there's any sort of one family rule. Nothing like that certainly exists within the Chinese Communist Party. But there is the question of line and the question of political orientation. And as you said, the party is presenting the idea that China has gone through stages, and the last stage, and the stage that is now being sort of followed up with a new stage, was the stage to use the means of production to develop in such a way, whether it was by capitalist methods or socialist methods or a combination of methods, to build the economy up. And now the new task is, having built the economy up or starting to reach critical mass, to go back to sort of the basics of the revolution, which is to overcome inequality, class division. In other words, it seems like Xi Jinping, at least the way it's being presented, is sort of going back to the original Chinese Communist Party orientation towards socialism and communism, rather than being focused purely on a developmental model that used capitalist property relations as a mechanism. Do you see it that way?
Yeah, I do agree that the leadership under Xi Jinping is definitely shifting towards combating inequality, towards lifting people's living conditions. And I think there's a really comprehensive approach that they're taking to try and make sure that this is the direction that China takes beyond for the next decades throughout the century and further, in enshrining the developments of Xi Jinping thought into the Constitution. The resolution which they passed yesterday in the closing session of the Congress said that the party must carry this thought out towards in the future and develop it and make it stronger. And a lot of the policy approaches that have been taken under Xi Jinping, I think, really support this idea that this is a push for a long-term change in direction for the party. We've seen a really strong emphasis on education and cultural development and cultivation of Marxist ideology and quote core socialist values throughout society. in even at the level of primary and middle schools, daily education. We see all sorts of regulations on party members and more strict regulations on Marxism in line with Xi Jinping's developments and his leadership of this sort of people-centered combating inequality path. And we also even see things in the media, like which have stipulated regulations that media content and even things like film and television content needs to be in line with core socialist values and not promote things that have been singled out as being in opposition to this, such as, and I'm quoting, like hedonism, radical individualism. So I really think there's a strong effort to make this a long-term shift in the party and not something short.
Yeah, I hear you. Aside from social values like hedonism and individualism, there are, of course, many very rich people, including capitalists, who are inside the Communist Party. There's millionaires who are inside the Communist Party and inside the parliament. We have about a minute left. Ideologically, people can say the same words about socialism or Marxism or, shared values. But, of course, there are class differences and antagonistic class differences. Again, the Chinese government seems to be arresting millionaires and billionaires in large numbers. So you're a billionaire in China, but that doesn't mean that you're not about to go to jail. We have about 45 seconds left. How will China or how will Xi Jinping's leadership manage that kind of contradiction?
I think towards by legislating and really solidifying the anti-corruption initiative, and I think why they're formulating this culturally is I think China wants to avoid the sort of great upheaval within its society, and it sees the class contradictions which exist in its society, but it wants to be able to eradicate them in a long-term harmonious sort of way, as opposed to like a very big upheaval. It's very concerned with maintaining stability. So I think we'll continue to see clamping down on corruption, on corrupt entrepreneurs, and we've seen there's lots of reports of increased regulations on the activities of entrepreneurs. We saw Wanda, the big corporation, its foreign direct investment was completely slashed this year because it wasn't in line with what the party wanted and what the party said that they had to do. So I think we're going to see a continued deepening of this sort of rule of the party and socialist development.
We're gonna come back and revisit this. This is a big issue, of course. China, the biggest country in the world, the most populous country in the world, and certainly the most dynamic economically and now internationally in terms of diplomacy. We've been joined from Toronto by political analyst and writer Ajit Singh. You're listening to Loud and Clear. After a short break, we'll be right back.
Loud and Clear.